There is a photograph of a ship at night, held upright in ice, lit from below so that every rope and spar glows white against a black sky. It is one of the most beautiful photographs ever taken in the polar regions, and the man who took it needed 20 separate flashes standing out in the dark at 40 below to get it. He took it of a ship that was already dying. Within weeks, the ice would begin closing on the hull like a fist, and within months, the ship in that picture would be at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. 28 men were standing on the ice around it. They were about to spend the next year and a half with no ship, no radio, no way to send a message, and no one on Earth who knew where they were. Every one of them came home. That is the part that does not fit. Polar expeditions of this era killed people routinely. Scott's party died on the way back from the pole 2 years earlier. The Franklin expedition lost all 129 men. Even Shackleton's own support party on the other side of the continent, the group nobody remembers, lost 3. So the question is not really how the Endurance was lost. It is how 28 men, stranded further from help than almost anyone in history, survived a sequence of separate disasters, each of which should have been enough on its own. There were 8 of them. Here they are in order. The crew was not a team of specialists. It was a scientist, a carpenter, a cook, a photographer, sailors, and a physicist, assembled fast and funded badly. 3 days out of South Georgia, they found a 19-year-old stowaway, Purse Blackborough, folded into a locker. Shackleton is said to have told him that if they ran short of food, stowaways got eaten first. Then he made him steward, and Blackborough later became the first person to set foot on Elephant Island, because his feet were too frostbitten to walk, and the boat crew simply lifted him out. The expedition left South Georgia on the 5th of December 1914, heading south into the Weddell Sea. The plan was to land at Vosel Bay and walk across the entire Antarctic continent, coast to coast, by way of the pole. Nobody had done it. Nobody has ever done it the way Shackleton intended. The first threat was the ice, and it arrived early. The Weddell Sea holds a slow clockwise rotation of pack ice, and 1915 was a heavy year. The ship pushed south through loosening and tightening floes for 6 weeks. On the 19th of January 1915, roughly 1 day's sail from the coast they were aiming for, the pack closed around the ship and stopped it. Frank Worsley, the captain, described it as being frozen like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. They were not crushed, not yet. They were simply held, and the ice they were held in was drifting north, away from the continent, carrying the ship with it. There was nothing to steer and nothing to push against. They settled in to wait for the spring thaw. That wait lasted 9 months. The second threat was what the ice did to the ship. Endurance was built in Norway in 1912, 144 feet of oak and greenheart, one of the strongest wooden ships ever made. It was designed for polar work. It was not designed to be squeezed. Pressure ridges began working against the hull through the winter. In October 1915, the pressure came from 2 directions at once, and the ship began to lose. Beams the thickness of a man's body bent and then split. Water came in faster than the pumps could take it out. On the 27th of October, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The men moved onto the floe with what they could carry. Endurance stayed above the ice, wrecked and leaning, for another 3 weeks. It went under on the 21st of November, 1915. Shackleton wrote one line in his diary that night: "I cannot write about it. The third threat is the one people underestimate, and it is the reason this story is not simply a shipwreck story. Nobody knew where they were. There was no radio contact." The wireless sets of the period could not reach anything from that latitude, and they had heard nothing since leaving South Georgia. No message had gone out saying the ship was beset or crushed or gone. The world's last information about the expedition was a year old and said they were sailing south in good order. If they died on that ice, the search would begin in the wrong place, years late, so there was never going to be a rescue. There was only going to be whatever these 28 men could do for themselves, and every plan from that point had to end with somebody walking or sailing to a place where humans lived. The fourth threat was time on the floe itself. They set up on the ice and drifted. First at a place they called Ocean Camp, then, when that broke up, at Patience Camp, which tells you most of what you need to know about the mood. They ate seal and penguin, and when those ran short they ate the dogs. Their tents were thin. The floor of the world under them was moving north at a rate they could measure but not influence, and it was rotting as it went because they were drifting into warmer water. They lived like that for 5 months. Frank Hurley, the photographer, went back down into the flooded wreck before it sank and pulled out his glass plate negatives. Then he and Shackleton sat down and smashed about 400 of them, keeping only 120, because Hurley had to be able to carry them, and because a man who might be tempted to come back for the rest is a man who will die coming back for the rest. That is where the photograph at the start of this video comes from. It survived because most of its siblings were deliberately destroyed. The fifth threat came on the 9th of April, 1916, when the floe finally cracked underneath them and there was no more waiting. They put 3 lifeboats into the water, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. What followed was 7 days in open boats in the Southern Ocean. Men soaked through and freezing, boats icing up and needing to be chipped clear, and almost no sleep for anyone. Several of the crew were by then obviously breaking down. On the 15th of April, they landed on Elephant Island. It was the first solid ground any of them had stood on in 497 days, which brings the 6th threat, and it is a cruel one. Elephant Island is land, and land was no good to them at all. It is a spike of rock and glacier off the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, uninhabited, with no shelter and nothing growing on it. Crucially, it sits nowhere near any shipping route. No vessel had reason to pass it, and no vessel was looking. They could stand on that beach until every one of them died, and nobody would ever know. Reaching land had not saved them. It had only stopped them from drowning. So Shackleton set up the 7th threat himself, deliberately, because the alternative was waiting to die politely. He took the largest of the 3 boats, the James Caird, 22.5 feet long. The carpenter Harry McNish raised her sides with wood salvaged from the other boats and decked her over with canvas, sledge runners, and the lids of packing cases, sealed with seal blood, oil paint, and whatever else was to hand. Then 6 men got into her and pushed off for South Georgia, 1,300 kilometers away. Across the Drake Passage, the stretch of water with the worst sustained weather on the planet in winter, Frank Worsley navigated. In 17 days, he was able to get a sight of the sun exactly 4 times, because the sky was almost never clear, and he had to do it braced against a pitching deck while another man held his legs. If his arithmetic drifted by 1 degree, they would pass South Georgia and sail into the open Atlantic, and nothing would stop them for thousands of miles. They took one wave so large that Shackleton first mistook the line of white foam on the horizon for a break in the clouds. It filled the boat. They bilated out with their hands. On the 10th of May, 1916, 17 days out, they made landfall on South Georgia, on the wrong side. The whaling stations, the people, the ships, everything they had crossed the ocean to reach were on the north coast. They had come ashore on the south, and the boat was now in no condition to sail around, and 2 of the 6 men were in no condition to go anywhere at all, which leaves the 8th and final threat. Between them and Stromness whaling station lay the interior of South Georgia, glaciers, unnamed peaks, crevasse fields. In 1916, no one had crossed it. There were no maps of the interior because there was nothing in the interior to map. Shackleton took Worsley and Tom Crean. Between them, they had 15 meters of rope, a carpenter's adze for an ice axe, and screws taken out of the James Caird driven through the soles of their boots for grip. They carried no tent and no sleeping bags, on the reasoning that if they stopped moving, they would not start again. They walked for 36 hours without sleeping. 3 times they climbed to a ridge and found the far side impassable and had to go back down. At one point, caught by darkness on a slope they could not descend safely, they coiled the rope, sat on it, and slid. On the 20th of May, 1916, 3 men walked into Stromness. The station manager knew Shackleton by sight and did not recognize him. The first thing they heard was that a war had started and was still going, and then it took 4 more months. Shackleton tried to reach Elephant Island 3 separate times and was turned back by ice on every attempt. The 4th attempt was made in a small Chilean steam tug called the Yelcho, commanded by Luis Pardo, a vessel with no business in those waters at all. On the 30th of August, 1916, the Yelcho came around the headland. On the beach, 22 men had spent 4.5 months living under 2 upturned lifeboats set on stone walls, a shelter roughly the size of a small room, which they called the Snuggery. They burned seal blubber for heat and light, so everything and everyone in it was coated black with greasy soot. They ate penguin, and when the penguins left, limpets prized off the rocks. 2 of the surgeons amputated Blackborough's frostbitten toes on the floor of that shelter by candlelight, with the blubber stove pushed close for warmth. Every single morning, Frank Wild had made them roll up their sleeping bags and pack, telling them the boss might come today. That morning he was right. Shackleton counted them from the deck before the boat had even reached the shore, all 22. 634 days after leaving South Georgia, every man who had sailed south on the Endurance was accounted for and alive. Look at that photograph again. A ship lit up in the dark, perfectly still, already doomed, with 28 men standing somewhere outside the frame. It is not a picture of a disaster. It turned out to be a picture of the moment before 8 consecutive disasters, none of which managed to kill anybody.